Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on that globe. So I think we can start with this webinar, and I would like to welcome you. I'm Séverine Deboos, and I work for the ILO in the Enterprise Department, based in Geneva at the headquarters. And I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar on social protection in small enterprises in COVID-19. And before we go into the topic, I have few usual announcement to make. So please make sure to mute yourself during the presentation, and of course we will have the opportunity to take question and answers, and also if you wish to raise your hand, you're very welcome to do that, and we can give you the possibility to take the floor and ask question to the panelists, or express some of your ideas. We will have 3 presentations during this webinar, and what we were suggesting with the presenters is to have the presentation. Then if there are any questions directly of clarification on the presentation, we can address them right after each presentation, and hoping to have some time at the end of the webinar to have more discussions and exchange on the topic. This webinar is recorded, so as usual, if you don't agree with that, you're very welcome to leave, but we hope that you will stay with us. I think I went through all the required information, and I'm asking Ella just to maybe put in the chat in case I forgot to mention something, and if not, I suggest that we start on the matter. So this webinar is part of a series organized by the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development and the Working Group on Business Environment Reform, and it is part of a series of discussion and exchange on how to use business environment reform to build back better. And this is, of course, the opportunity when we can and should take the possibility to discuss some of these issues that were not so much on the agenda before, but came at the forefront with the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on our society. So, of course, social protection is not a new concept, and my colleagues in the ILO would be the first one to be upset at me if I was saying that it's a new concept. And of course, the promotion of the universal social protection coverage has been on the agenda for long. However, there's very limited work done in the literature and in terms of project interventions on the question of social protection and small enterprises. The main issue which is typically addressed concerns the capacity of small firms to contribute to social security program, and what are the different options directly through the contribution by small firms or from general tax revenues, so that they can participate in different programs. And that's usually how we see social protection and small and medium enterprises. I was mentioning social protection is not a new issue, but unfortunately, still 53% of the global population is still unprotected. And these are the latest data from the World Report on Social Protection that the ILO has published earlier this year. COVID-19 has proven, if we needed to, how social protection is key. And we counted about 1,700 new social protection measures adopted during the COVID-19 as a direct response by governments to protect individuals. And these measures have been certainly life-saving for a number of individuals. However, these measures were temporary and very often concentrated in high and upper middle income countries. So the challenge is now how to find a new business model and make particular effort to extend social protection to all types of employment, and including the one that we can find in small enterprises. And this is where this webinar, we hope, can help us look at this issue and discuss on what are the options and what can be, from the business environment perspective, some of the response that we can provide as donors and as multilaterals in the dialogue on these issues. For this webinar, I have the pleasure to welcome three presenters. The first one, Christina Behrendt, will be presenting on the issue and challenges to extend social protection to small enterprises. Then Nina Torm will make a presentation on the reforms to support the extension of social protection to small enterprises in Vietnam. And Ngosa will look at the case of Zambia and how some reforms were enacted to support the extension of social protection to small enterprises in that country. And after these three presentations, we will have some questions, comments, and the time for discussing. So what I suggest is that we start with the first presentation by my colleague Christina Behrendt. Thank you, Hela, for the slides. Who is the head of the social policy unit in the social protection department in ILO Geneva. And if you allow me, and I will not read the resume of Christina so that we can go directly into the presentation. Thank you very much. Christina, the floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Séverine, and good morning and good afternoon and good evening to all of you. And thank you very much for having come and joined this discussion. And I think this is a very welcome opportunity to bring together two very important topics that we're dealing with and looking specifically at the issues and challenges in extending social protection to small enterprises. And I think the question here, and I think the COVID-19 has a bit changed in a way also the game plan, because it has put social protection much higher on the agenda, and in particular it has shown how much social protection is important, not just for workers and not just for the population as a whole, but also for enterprises. And I think that has been quite a game changer in many ways. So as Séverine has already mentioned, many countries have on the one hand mobilized their social protection systems that were already in place to protect people's health and jobs and incomes. And then also countries in really all over the world have taken additional measures to support workers and enterprises during the crisis. And I think these measures have really been essential and important in helping countries to better navigate through the crisis. So measures like supporting access to healthcare, both with regard to treatment and testing, also preventing job losses and also providing income security to workers, both those who had to reduce their working time through employment retention schemes, but also those who have lost their jobs through unemployment benefits. And very importantly, also sickness benefits, for example, have moved quite high up the agenda. And countries basically used whatever they had in place, using both tax finance schemes and social insurance schemes. And they were using both actually to channel those additional resources through these mechanisms. And it was important, as Séverine has mentioned, that these additional measures, they were really critical in the reaction, but quite often they were very temporary. So at the moment, many of those measures have already ended. And the other question is, or the other point and really main lessons learned is also the fact that we have seen that countries who had good social protection systems in place, they were really able to react much faster and much better. And I think this is one of the reasons why especially higher income countries and also to some extent middle income countries have been able to mobilize much more resources to support workers and enterprises in that respect. And this really begs the question of what countries can do now to reinforce their social protection systems for the future, for more sustainable solutions, not just for the next crisis, but really for every day. And if we can go to the next slide, I think what is really come out very clearly now through this experience is how much social protection has not just a social role to play, but also an economic role to play. And we know that especially for really kind of very small businesses and micro businesses, people kind of starting up their business, the question of social risks and their income and business and livelihood risks are really two sides of the same medal. And quite often, for example, when it comes to, for example, health risks, when it comes to paying for healthcare in countries where there are no appropriate health protection mechanisms in place, this is not just a personal risk and not just a risk for the family of entrepreneurs, but it's very much for them also a business risk, both for themselves as the entrepreneur, but also for the workers that they employ. So looking at this interaction and interdependency of social risks and economic risks or business risks is really important. And I think COVID-19 has really put that very high on the global agenda. But we know, and this is also what Séverine has already mentioned, that the majority of the global population are not covered by social protection mechanisms. So 4.1 billion people are excluded, and this creates really a huge challenge, especially for poorer countries, where we find most of those excluded, and those countries cannot use the potential of social protection systems in order to have a kind of a positive business environment that promotes productivity, for example, where you have also mechanisms to stabilize aggregate demand, also helping economies to facilitate structural change, both structural change with regard to changing between kind of low productivity sectors and higher productivity sectors, but also very importantly in the current context, also in the context of climate change and the climate crisis, and the question how countries can really have a just transition to a more kind of a net zero economy. So I don't want to go through all the different points that I have put on the slides, but I think it's important really to see the positive impacts of investment in social protection, both at the micro level, when we think about health, nutrition, and education outcomes, building and protecting human capabilities, or also kind of human capital in some ways, and really looking also at the importance with regard to productivity and employability. But at the same time, we also know how much social protection is important at the meso level when it comes to the local economy, and especially looking at remote communities, for example. And there has been very interesting research being done by UNICEF and the FAO, and I recognize that there's I don't see her anymore in the list of participants, so Pamela from FAO, who's been involved in that, on multiplier factors of social protection. So basically, for every dollar that comes into a poor economy, it has kind of around double the effect on the local economy. So I think looking at these positive effects is very important. But let's maybe zoom in more specifically on what it means for enterprises. And with that, we can go to the next slide, please. And the question of how social protection matters for enterprises, I think it's a very important one. And I think it matters in two respects. It matters when it comes to the enterprise's current employees or the current workers working for the enterprises, but it also matters with regard to the future workforce and wider society. And I think in that respect, I have distinguished now on this slide three different types of social protection that are relevant in that context, and which are all sometimes a bit mixed up. And I think it's important really to distinguish these different mechanisms and look at the implications that they have on the way how they impact also the operations of enterprises. One part of social protection is really the social protection that enterprises are providing directly to workers, and this is quite often related to obligations they have under the labor law. For example, when it comes to paid maternity leave, paid sick leave, for example, severance pay, employer-sponsored health insurance. So these are forms of social protection that are linked to a specific work contract with a specific employer. The other main part here is the role of social insurance in that respect. So social insurance being financed by contributions from both workers and enterprises, and in many ways, the social insurance mechanisms, they fulfill quite similar functions, but they fulfill it in a different way because it is a mechanism for risk pooling for both workers and for enterprises. And I think this is particularly important for small enterprises, because small enterprises quite often they don't really have the capacity, and they really face difficulties when it comes, for example, to pay maternity leave when an employee leaves on maternity leave. And this is where we see that in many cases those enterprises, they either don't comply, sometimes they're also dismissing pregnant workers or don't hire them in the first place. So it really has some implications. Whereas if the maternity benefits are being financed through social insurance, there is this risk pooling both for workers and the enterprises, which makes it much easier actually for small enterprises to provide that level of social protection. And this is also one of the reasons why ILO standards actually promote the establishment of social insurance, or really encourage countries to move from these employer liability mechanisms towards social insurance, because it has this essential level of risk pooling, which helps to avoid labor market distortions and can really facilitate labor market mobility, and in many ways also supports gender equality. And then there's the third type of benefits, which is tax finance benefits. And this is more, their enterprises are not directly involved, they're indirectly involved by the fact that they are paying taxes, but they're not directly involved. But I think the social protection system as a whole really plays an important role for enterprises, both large and small. And if we can move to the to the next slide. And I realize I really have to speed up. I think what is important here, and I don't want to spend much time on that slide, but what we can see is that indeed we have a huge challenge when it comes to social security coverage for workers in small enterprises. And this is data from the from Latin America, but the situation looks quite similar in other parts of the world, but the data might not necessarily be available. So in small enterprises, coverage rates of workers tend to be much lower than for larger enterprises. But the good news is that actually countries have put in place measures in some countries, and particularly in Latin America, for example, through the so-called monotax mechanisms, which are highlighted in a brief that we've been working with our colleagues from the enterprise department to really facilitate coverage for those workers. And I think that really has also led to a significant increase in coverage of workers in small enterprises. Go to the next slide, please. So these monotax mechanisms and more generally mechanisms to facilitate access, facilitate administrative mechanisms, develop adapted financing mechanisms. This is really one of the measures that governments can put in place to make it much easier for small enterprises actually to ensure their workers in social insurance and also ensure that they have access to social protection. But there are a number of other mechanisms that relate, for example, to the adapting legal frameworks, aligning the benefit packages with people's needs, and I would actually add also the needs of enterprises. The streamlining administrative procedures, raising awareness and sharing information, strengthening incentives for compliance. So there's quite a long list of things that countries can do depending on their situation. And I've added a link to an electronic platform that we have on this regard. And then I'll move to my last slide. So now at this point, social protection systems are really at a crossroads. Now, having come out of the COVID-19 crisis, I think many countries have realized how important it is actually that they invest more in social protection systems, and specifically that they increase social protection coverage for workers in all types of employment, including those in temporary employment, part-time employment, and also self-employment. But this is not just a question of adapting legal frameworks and saying, well, now everyone is covered, but you really need to put in place mechanisms to make it possible for enterprises to actually comply with those mechanisms. But I think there is quite a lot that can be done in that respect to really support countries in doing that, and really thinking about extending social security coverage in conjunction also with the formalization of employment and enterprises, because this is really what makes those strategies sustainable and equitable, really thinking about the adapted mechanisms. And this is actually one of the parts, or one of the big chunks of work that the ILO is doing, and with that we're collaborating also closely with Séverine and her colleagues to really make that happen. And I think with that, I'm ending here and trying to be right on time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you for this presentation, and sorry for rushing you through the end. The presentation will be shared in any case to the participants. Unless, and I'm checking the chat, but I don't see some questions in the chat for clarification. So I suggest that we go to the next presentation. Christina, you presented us the framework, and you set the scene in terms of what are some incentives, why it's important for now, but also for the future. And you told us that it's actually possible, right, to extend social protection, including to small and medium enterprises. You had to rush through the number of things that country can do, but that's fine because Nina will actually share with us the experience of Vietnam and what has been done in Vietnam to actually make sure or extend social protection to SMEs in that country. And Nina works in the Department of Social Science and Business at Roskilde University in Denmark. And she's done some research on enterprise worker dynamics, labor market regulation, social protection, informal worker organization, and informality. So Nina, thank you very much. And we are all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Séverine, and thank you for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. And good morning and good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. So yes, I am going to talk for a very short period of time on the case of Vietnam. And my presentation focuses mostly on what has happened pre-COVID, so that you have an idea of the situation that the country was in when COVID hit. Vietnam is, for many reasons, a very interesting country to study. And I could spend hours talking about that, but just to say that, of course, it's a country that has gone through an enormous structural transformation over a relatively short period of time. It has for decades seen extremely high economic growth, and which has been translated into substantial social progress. So some of the recent figures, actually by experts at the ILO, have estimated that since the turn of the century, working poverty has fallen from as much as over 70% to only 7%. And prior to that, also a substantial decrease in poverty. So in addition to this vast social transformation caused by structural changes in the economy, we've also seen, and that's part of the reason that social transformation has taken place, a proliferation of private sector enterprises, increasing both in terms of shares of employment and output. And here, very much, we're talking about SMEs. So that this group of enterprises basically make up close to the entire population of private firms in Vietnam. They employ a very large share of the population, and they account for a large share of GDP. These figures are, of course, slightly underestimated, given that we're not including those that operate outside of the formal sector. So household businesses, own account workers, micro enterprises, and so on, that obviously constitute an enormous share. Next slide, please. Yeah. But so what has been mentioned several times already, and I won't go into too much detail on that, is that, of course, SMEs are characterized by extremely poor working conditions for workers and very limited social protection coverage. And that also applies in the formal sector. So you have registered formal enterprises that might have workers on very limited or short-term contracts that are not covered by much or by any social protection. In recent years, however, there has been a change in this dimension, and Vietnam has done quite a lot on the social protection front. So the share of registered enterprises that contribute to the Social Security Fund has increased quite substantially in the past decade or so. So now estimates say that it's around 60%. But again, recall that this is out of all the registered enterprises, so it doesn't include informal ones. And these increases can be attributed to a number of things, but the Vietnamese government has been very strong in actively promoting social protection as an engine of growth, and also, of course, as development. So they have gradually, at a sort of reasonable pace increased mandatory social insurance rates, of course, sort of being careful that they don't boost them too high or aim too high, and it would have a sort of a reversed consequence compared to what was intended. But this has been going on gradually over time through various legal interventions. Of course, what we see is that enterprises may be contributing as they should do by law, but often what we also see is that the actual contributions don't always correspond to the rates that they're supposed to be. So that could be because the rates have increased over time, and some smaller enterprises may not be aware of this. It could also be because for tax reasons or whatever, wages are being underreported. And wages, of course, are the base on which social contributions are made, so that would affect the amount. Could also be, failure or sort of omission to register all employees with Vietnam Social Security. So even if the rate of enterprises that are contributing is increasing, there is still a gap in terms of the amount of contributions, and that has caused concerns as to the sustainability of the funds, of course, in the long term. And that coupled with also challenges in terms of enforcing and inspections and so on, means that there is still a substantial compliance gap in Vietnam. So this research that I've been working on, actually together with Sang Yuen Lee at the ILO, and with support from both the ILO Bangkok and Hanoi office, it came out of looking at what was existing already in terms of research. And here we saw that much of what was being done was looking at this limited coverage, right? That sort of we talked about the low levels of benefit and financial sustainability issues. So we decided to try and use some data to look at, but what can we say something positive about what are the implications of social security compliance for the firm? So can we say something about benefits that might entice enterprises to be more compliant? And that's basically the focus of this work that I'll just spend the next sort of few minutes highlighting or condensing. So we've done 2 studies over in total a period of time of around 10 years. And during, as I mentioned before, during this time, a lot has happened with a new social insurance law, still actually being reworked as we speak, a health insurance law, and increasing contribution rates. So an interesting time to look at how firms sort of adopt or adapt to changing regulations. And so what we see is that during this 10-year period, the rate of social security coverage for workers in these manufacturing and construction firms that we focus on has indeed increased over time. So that's really a positive thing, and it has to do with changing regulations. Next slide, please. And then what we do is through various sort of statistical and econometric analysis, is to try and see, okay, so what happens when the share of workers in a firm increases, that the share of workers that receive social security increases? How does that affect firm level outcomes? Of course, a number of factors can affect both of these, right? So the size of the firms, their age, the location, the industry, and so on. And because of the data being census data at the micro level, we're able to factor in these factors. And what we basically find, to sort of boil it down, is that firms that increase their social security coverage, so the share of workers that receive or that the firm contributes social security for, and here we're talking mostly of health and pension, when that increases by 10%, the associated revenue gain for the firm is between 1 to 2%, depending on the time period. And then when we look at profit, we also see a profit gain, though that is more fluctuating and sort of also varies much over the time period. So you can think and sort of wonder about the reasons behind this. And I think I should just I realize I'm running short of time. But basically what we 5 minutes, thank you, Ella. What we sort of hypothesize is that the reason that you would see firms experiencing gains in terms of revenue from contributing to Social Security is that they may be able to attract more qualified workers, retain workers for longer, and thereby increase their productivity. They might also be able to connect with customers that require this kind of well, you could say probably CSR, but that requires sort of legal compliance, and therefore they may be able to boost their revenue through that. Profit, of course, is a little bit more tricky to understand because Social Security is a cost, right? So, and that's probably why we see that over time, with the mandatory social contribution rates increasing, the profit rate also drops slightly, right? But nevertheless, it seems that the revenue is able to increase to the extent that profits are still at the minimum maintained, sort of at a low level. Important here to say, and that's what the next slide is on, is that there's a lot of variation by firm size. And that is, of course, to be expected, given that there's enormous difference between whether you're looking at the micro firms or the medium firms. For the very small firms, so the micro firms, they struggle initially with the Social Security costs. Of course, they're not as established as the slightly larger firms. So it takes some time to adjust to the higher labor costs. It might mean that they will adjust their labor force or their workforce for some time, employs more temporary workers that are not mandated to have Social Security. So of course that's sort of a trade-off, and you have to carefully weigh up these things when you think of drawing up schemes that SMEs can afford. As for the small firms, and that's the sort of the largest share of the sample, we also see the profit falls is sort of gradually over time, and again, it could be due to a time lag before the firms actually adjust their production structures to the Social Security costs. For the medium firms, these seem to be more sturdy, to be expected, right? Also probably more aware of the legal framework, so they may be able to preempt changes and sort of adjust their cost structures in advance. They probably are more likely to employ a larger share of workers on a more permanent basis. And of course, they have a much longer business horizon. So it's easier for them to sort of cover some of their initial sunk costs or to be able to plan for future expenses. Yeah, and I think just summing up, then so what we find is that actually, of course, this is very cautionary, and we're still working actually on the methodology and on the analysis, but it seems to indicate that there is actually benefits to both the workers and the firms when they opt for increased Social Security provision. And that is something that we've sort of tried to emphasize so that employers don't see this just as a simple cost burden. I mentioned before that reasons for this could be you're able to attract a more motivated and more qualified workforce if you're able to provide a sort of fuller package, access to larger customers, and so on. And of course, what we've also seen, and that's very much in line with recent ILO work as well, is that Vietnam is really seeing an increased formalization of the workforce, especially within these larger firms. So enterprises that would rely much more on temporary and casual labor traditionally are increasingly formalizing their workers. And that will only, of course, add to the positive outcomes of this. So I think I'll end there, and thank you very much. I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Nina. That's very interesting, and I think quite unique in terms of research and results that can help us also to inform the the approach and how we advise our partners in terms of benefits, yes, but adjustments, especially when we look at the micro and small firms, and so how to adjust the strategy so that the trade-off are not so strong and that the longer term vision is there. So thank you so much, and I hope we can then further discuss in the question and answers. But before that, I would like to now turn to Ngosa, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Lusaka and who has been involved in the implementation of social protection programs in Zambia, and who is currently chairing the board for the Southern African Social Protection Experts Network. So that's also bringing a more regional vision on the issue. And Ngosa is going to present us the experience of Zambia, and then during the discussion we can then extend to a more regional and more larger geographical zone. Thank you so much, Ngosa.
All right, thank you very much, Séverine, for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. And the presentation is on the reforms to support the extension of social protection to small enterprises in Zambia. In terms of the context, which is on the next slide, Zambia basically has a population of about 19 million. That's now the 2021 estimate. GDP about 18.9 billion. Mainly the main drivers of economic growth, it's mining, agriculture, and construction. But in terms of inequality, I think there's rising inequality, which is quite high at 6.9. Now, in terms of labor statistics, we've got about 9.7 million constitute the total working population. 89% of these workers are actually in the informal economy, whilst the formal economy sector comprises the 11%. And we see in terms of gender, I think there is more 56% of women, and more of the labor force, 62% is in the rural areas. Now, as a government, to address issues of social protection, a national social security policy was launched in 2014. And this policy developed a framework to govern the development, implementation, and coordination of social protection programs. And part of the vision was to also develop some umbrella legislation that will regulate all social protection interventions. ILO has been very supportive, I think, in providing some technical backstopping in the drafting of the draft social protection bill, which is yet to be finalized. Then in terms of the Zambia social protection system, it has two components. There's a one financed by the contributions, mainly for workers in the formal sector. Here we're talking about the biggest institutions such as NAPSA that sort of caters for 677,000, and the other private occupational schemes. Then there's the tax financed programs, which are the social assistance schemes, the cash transfer, where we've seen the upscaling of households from 700,000 to 994,000 households. The budget for 2021 constitutes in US dollars, 135 million US dollars. That's in the national budget, which in Zambian kwacha is 2.3 billion. Then there's also the ongoing farmer input support program, which are sort of trying to target the vulnerable. Now, as part of a government's holistic approach, a technical working group on the extension of social protection was set up, and it adopted a universal approach rather than a piecemeal fragmented approach. And obviously the idea was to address or come up with tailor-made strategies that could be more responsive to the demands of the informal economy, so that these schemes should move from focusing on enforcement to promotion of incentives, as this promotes compliance amongst workers and employees. Now, as there was a study done, which some of the material in this presentation is also drawn from. This was an ILO study that on extending social protection to workers in the informal economy, the case of Zambia. It looked at three groups. Looked at domestic workers, smallholder workers, and workers in the construction industry. And most of the key issues that came up, next slide, please, in this study, I think, was to try and establish the kind of employment arrangements that were in place. I think in most cases, oral contracts were quite predominant. And then obviously there was a variety in terms of the employment relationships that existed. They were quite various, especially in the agriculture, to do with seasonal. And then there was also high job insecurity, because most of the work was casualized and sort of piecework oriented. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of the strategy of what was learned from there, is that, as mentioned earlier through the technical working group, that the national strategy was to focus on a universal approach rather than a piecemeal approach, so as to adapt to various different circumstances, such as employment arrangements in the informal economy, which was sort of guided by the universality principle. Then also to adapt design of benefit packages to the informal sector, so that they move the focus from enforcement to promotion of incentives, and also to establish incentives for enrollment in the form of co-financing, particularly for those who are self-employed. Then the design of social security provisions for informal economy that should not serve as a disincentive. And then lastly, to innovate delivery mechanisms so that new technologies may provide a breakthrough to overcome the fragmentation. Now, what were the lessons learned? Some of the lessons learned in this process, some of the issues I may later speak more in detail, maybe during the question and answer, was obviously the issue of the quick wins versus the long-term gains in terms of what actually could be more significant. I think the theme is social protection and COVID-19, but how can the workers in the informal economy access certain provisions in terms when they face these risks, especially the health-related risks. So I think those needed to be seen as quick wins. And then also the other multifaceted problem that required complex response with technical expertise was the issue of legislation, product design, administration, financing, and institutional coordination. One institution was used for this, and this is the National Pension Scheme Authority. And in this vein, a statutory instrument number 72 of 2019 was actually released by government on actually providing for benefits for the informal economy, legislating for it. The other lesson learned was that no silver bullet. It was important to invest in assessments, experimentations, and evaluation. And then also it was very critical. There are a number of associations that represent the informal economy, ASEA. So social dialogue, I think, was very critical to success, to ensure that there is also the perspective of the workers, so that they could actually state whether which of these risks are actually more important to them as the design process is undertaken. And then lastly is basically the creation of policy space for discussion of social protection systems in an integrated manner. And obviously considering the synergies then between contributory and non-contributory systems. Okay, thank you very much. So I think in principle, I could summarize there. There's still a lot to discuss when we come to obviously the opportunities and probably how we could further undertake other measures, be it legal, regulatory provisions, so that there is more of a cost-benefit approach. Thank you very much. So I think I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ngosa, for this for the presentation. And it's now time for question and answers, and I would welcome participants just to you can either put your name in the chat box or raise your hand, to take the floor and ask the question. But maybe to start and to shoot on exchanges. So there's one category that we had discussed in the preparation whether to include or not to include. It's the informal enterprises, right? And Ngosa, you mentioned quite a lot the informal enterprises. Nina, you mentioned them in a certain extent, but that could be, and that has been, of course, one of the biggest challenge also during the COVID-19 crisis, and how to make sure that these workers who are completely excluded from most of the time social protection schemes can actually get in a certain extent some protection. So I would like to ask first Nina, in what extent the informal workers have been covered by measures that were implemented in Vietnam during the COVID-19 crisis, and maybe whether you have some reflections on that, and how we can learn from these measures, and how they might be able to teach us on how to do better in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Séverine, for that question. You're absolutely right. I kind of navigated around it because it's a little bit of a complex issue, and not least in the light of COVID. And basically the measures, so Vietnam was quite quick in extending measures in the light of COVID, at least initially enacted a sort of a resolution number 42 with a series of measures. But of course, these are mostly targeted at formal workers and formal businesses, so wage subsidies and credits. And then also, it's sort of additionally, they introduced a number of social assistance measures, so non-contributor cash transfers, one-off benefits. And those, of course, are targeted mostly at poor households and so on. So somehow what happens is that informal low-income workers fall somewhere in between, right? Because they don't benefit from the measures that are tied to being in a work contract relations, so the sort of wage credit measures and wage subsidies, and at the same time, by being businesses, they don't qualify perhaps for social assistance transfers. So you have in Vietnam this share of around 11 million workers in the informal sector. And on top of that, around 22 million agricultural workers in household businesses that are more or less have been left unprotected from these COVID specific packages. So and that's still the sort of discussions on how to reach those and to protect those is still ongoing. The Vietnam Social Security is considered to be very important to identify those informal workers that are already benefiting from some form of social protection, and to also sort of avoid duplicating coverage, because of course it's all a little bit schemes that somehow a little bit overlap, right? And the challenge, of course, is this thing of having a number of schemes that target poor people, but they don't perhaps reach the right beneficiaries, right? The usual targeting versus universalism. So I think there's a kind of a move towards how do we find a uniform set of measures that will also cover informal workers in formal enterprises or in informal sector. So yeah, it's a challenge, and there are no sort of correct answers or solutions at the moment. Yeah, that's my short sort of answer.
No, that's great. And that actually leads me to a next question to Christina. You had to rush through, I mean, your last slide on the global flagship program, but actually what Nina was just mentioned, right? The number of schemes that targets and really having some targeted interventions versus universal, right? So, I mean, what can be done, or what is the approach to actually and the balance between this targeting versus universal protection when we talk about the social protection floors, and how the ILO is looking at that issue?
Yeah, thanks, Séverine, for the question. I think that complements indeed quite well what Nina has already explained, especially when it comes to covering those who are often considered as the missing middle. That is those who are not covered by the existing mechanisms, which cover mostly the workers in the formal economy, and do not have access also to schemes which are targeted specifically at poor populations. So we have those in the middle, and where we actually find many of those who are working in small enterprises, or either working in small enterprises or owning small enterprises. I think we need to talk about both, who are in a way falling through the cracks. And indeed, I mean, the ILO promotes very strongly universal social protection systems, in the sense it's not being prescriptive about kind of necessarily having kind of a specific type of scheme, as long as the type of scheme really kind of complies with the principles that are set out in ILO standards. But what we see in many countries, I mean, many countries have gone to have kind of universal programs or schemes which are really kind of, or sometimes they're also referred to as categorical programs. So like social pensions that go to everyone over a certain age. And many countries, for example, are currently thinking about universal child benefits, really to provide coverage for all children. So I think these are, but at the same time also, I mean, other countries, and I think this has very much also to do with kind of national traditions and culture. So other countries, they're looking more into programs which are more targeting towards full populations. What from an ILO perspective, what is important in these mechanisms is really that they're based on rights, that they're transparent, that there is an accountability also of the state, and especially that people understand why they're receiving a certain benefit and why they're not. And this is often not the case in many programs that we see who are targeted towards the poor, but which are operating with mechanisms where people don't really understand why they receive the benefits or why they don't. And I think the other point which is important is really thinking about how different types of schemes complement each other, and especially now thinking about the complementarity between tax financed schemes and social insurance, for example, is an important one. And so, I mean, maybe coming back to the question that you asked, Nina, about covering those in the informal sector. I think for the ILO, it's very clear that there should be a social protection floor, which means that this is a kind of a guarantee of access to healthcare and at least the basic level of income security, which should be provided to all. And this would obviously also include those who are in the informal sector, in informal employment. But at the same time, I think there's also a question of ensuring that the social protection also helps to encourage people to move from the informal to the formal economy. And I think we all know that there are some types of enterprises which are in the informal sector, although they wouldn't have to be in the informal sector. And I think this is where we talk about evasion, basically, for enterprises that would have the possibility to contribute, to also pay taxes. And I think this is really a critical issue to make sure, on the one hand, to provide support to those who don't really have the capacities to contribute, but on the other hand, also to promote compliance and ensure that those who can contribute and those who can pay taxes actually do that, because I think that is a matter of national solidarity and it's a matter of sustainability and equity. So, and I think finding a good balance between all of these measures are important. I think I don't think that there is one single way of achieving that. And we see that countries find different ways of really kind of squaring that cycle. But I think it's important really to think about these broader principles and think about how countries can actually put in place policies. And I think this is not just social protection policies, but it's also kind of enterprise policies and employment policies and macroeconomic policies, fiscal policies that really kind of work together in a way that they provide this environment that can really promote, on the one hand, the access to social protection, but also on the other hand, a functioning economy, and also which promotes the transition from the informal to the formal economy. I hope I at least kind of answered your question.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Christina. And I don't see any questions coming in the chat, so maybe I will just keep on asking one last question also to Ngosa. And Ngosa, it's interesting because you mentioned some dimension of sectoral approach and some sectors that might have some more, I mean, for which it's easier, right, to adapt to the process of extension of social protection. Could you share with us a little bit more on that dimension? I mean, sectoral approach on the extension of social protection.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, one of the sectors that is quite key was the construction sector. Construction sector has been quite, identified because of the ability to sort of increase awareness, address issues of coverage and compliance because of, I think, compliance to social security standards. And there are a number of institutions that were willing to support the construction sector. We're talking about the National Pension Scheme and the Workers' Compensation, because they had a single working approach. And then also this sector had already mechanisms for social dialogue, and also to address potential solutions to the extension of social protection. So definitely that created an avenue for increased access to social protection, and also the ability to even create partnerships as well as possibility for replication. And then I think economically, when I spoke about the figures of the Zambian economy, the construction sector has been one of the highest growing sectors in the economy. So definitely, because of that, it was attracting, I think, huge numbers of workers. So that created, I think, an opportunity to sort of, develop, synergies so that you could address the possible risks associated with this boom. I mean, there's possibly the risks of sickness, issues of, injury, and even medicals, all those disabilities. So I think it created some very, very interesting scenarios. Yeah. I hope I've answered your question on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ngosa. And I mean, maybe to close up a little bit the discussion, and I think we've heard a few cases, and I mean, for participants who are there, I mean, we would also be very much interested to either, I mean, further on within the business environment working group in the donor committee or through other channels to continue gather some experience and what can be done indeed to extend social protection to SMEs, both the owners and the workers in smaller enterprises, because as we could see, it's quite difficult, right? I mean, it's still a vast field of research that still needs to be further inquired. And when we discussed this webinar and we were trying to find some cases, that was quite challenging, I have to say. So, and I see Nina raising her hand and wanting to share, maybe, right, on that. But this would be really interesting and something that we would be happy to further discuss. Nina? Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, I wanted to add something actually to what Christina, but only if we had time. So that was, yeah, is it okay now?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, because no, I just wanted to add something that when Christina was saying earlier about this sort of balance between, of course, providing universal measures, but also encouraging very much formalization. And I had a couple of points in the last slide that I sort of I didn't mention because of time reasons, but basically, I mean, the policy implications, which of course is what is important to a lot of both participants and government, both in Vietnam but also beyond, is how do we basically draw up concrete measures that can sort of facilitate that process, right, for SMEs? And in the case of Vietnam, I mean, what we have started to see is that the sort of official stance is to subsidize initial social contributions to some of the smaller firms, to give them tax breaks and so on. So that this is beyond, or not in the context of COVID, but really to try and encourage and to provide further financial incentives, so that the firms don't see this as a block to their sort of future development. So I'm very much in line with what Christina is saying about really trying to encourage formalization, but through providing the right incentives. And then, of course, at some stage when firms become able to sort of lift or carry the burden by themselves, and we shouldn't see it as a burden because there are beneficial social outcomes, then these tax breaks and subsidies can sort of be lifted, right? You could also lessen some of the registration procedures are quite complex, right? Firms have to go to several stops for registration, and that can be made simpler. And so on. So these are sort of incentives that, of course, COVID has kind of stalled a little bit, perhaps the progress on this, but I think at the same time has also reinforced the importance of making registration of smaller firms and their ability to be part of a social security system more important. So that was all I felt like I didn't really have enough time to talk on the sort of policy implications. So, but yeah. That was it for now. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Nina. And maybe to close on that and the need to continue and use these various experience and conclusions. The UN Secretary General actually launched very recently what is now being called the Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection, which is I mean, bringing together these various dimensions and preaching and calling upon the various governments and the various states, right, to join force so that actually we can yeah, we can promote further and definitely make sure that we are building back better, as we now quite too often call it, but hopefully will be the case. Christina, do you want to say just a few words on the accelerator? And then I suggest that we close up the webinar. But Christina, if you can just tell us a few words.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Séverine. Indeed, and I think some of you might already be familiar with this global accelerator on jobs and social protection that the UN Secretary General has launched end of September. And I think he has also in his report that he had published previously, our common agenda, he's really kind of put the issues of jobs and social protection very, very high on the agenda, with a very strong emphasis also on the climate dimension. So really thinking in order to think more systematically about the ways how both employment policies and social protection policies, and I think also by extension policies that support enterprises and the business environment can really work together in a way that really kind of supports the economy. And I think for social protection, I think it's very important that it really highlights the economic dimension of social protection, because in the international context, I mean, the way how social protection is discussed is often limited to kind of measures that support the poor, or quite often in a humanitarian context. But it underplays the importance of social protection really for everyone. And I think this is where this notion of universal social protection systems is important, to really realize that everyone needs social protection, but it's not necessarily through the same mechanisms necessarily, but it's really about building those universal social protection systems based on a rights-based approach that can really help both people and the economy and the planet. So I think it's really having these three elements on it. And I think this is also an important initiative. Also, it has an important financing component also to it. I think this is a big, if you read the report or the brief of the Secretary General, you will see that a lot of it is also on financing social protection. So on the one hand, really on financing through the domestic mechanisms, and here also looking at both at national tax systems and also social insurance as another important channel of financing, but then also supporting poor countries in really building up their systems in order for them to play that role. And I think this global accelerator really plays a very important role, because it really changes also the narrative on how we think about social protection in that context, but with a very strong emphasis also on the link to employment, and also on the link to climate change. And I've also posted in the chat a link to the ILO's global flagship program on social protection for all. We just launched last week the second phase of it, and I think the objectives of that program is very much aligned with what we have been discussing today. So I think it's really also about having really a very broad and integrated approach to build up those social protection systems, that they can really work for people and the economy. So thanks a lot, and it's really been a pleasure of having that discussion with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and I would like also to thank, of course, Nina and Ngosa for their presentation and sharing the country cases and their views. We are coming close to the end of the webinar, so I would also like to thank Simon from the Business Environment Working Group, who has been also behind the organization and the thinking and the concept of the webinar, Ella and Jim, who have been also helping us and also helping us to go through the webinar and think through on how to articulate it and make it work. So thank you very much, everybody, and of course from the donor committee and the Business Environment Working Group, I would like to see whether we can continue the discussion. That would be really interesting. But so thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of the day, evening, morning. Thank you.